A pleasant day to you, icons and lady icons. Welcome to the third module of our discussion when it comes to the subject special topics in natural science. And in this module, we are going to talk about the remaining parts of our discussion when it comes to electricity. But before we proceed with the main part of our discussion, which will simply revolve around the concept of household electricity and circuits, let's have a short recall of the lessons that we had. Remember that when it comes to electricity, we're going to adopt here the different variables that were mentioned in the Ohm's law. And those are voltage, current, and resistance. Whenever we are talking about voltage, it is known as the potential difference, or it is now what we know as the push needed by charges for them to move throughout the wire from the positive or the negative terminal of the battery or the electron source, or rather from negative or positive depending upon what type of current will simply be considered. Then, speaking of which, whenever we are talking about current, it is now the flow of electric charge from one end to another end. Then, voltage and current as mentioned by Ohm's law from George Simon Ohm. Resistance is simply the resist in the flow of charges, and whenever we are talking about a certain type of resist, it is technically affecting the voltage and the current. It is technically affecting the amount of electricity that is simply present on a certain type of appliance or gadget. Now, let's proceed to the main part of our discussion. We're going to talk about electric power. And whenever we are talking about electric power, it is always represented by capital letter P. Okay, so once again, in the case of electric power, it is always represented by capital letter P. And the unit that we are using for electric power, it is equivalent to watt or watts. But whenever we are talking about household electricity, the name that will always be mentioned here, it is the main provider of electricity here in Bulacan, which is Meralco. In Meralco, they're actually using the unit kilowatt or kilowatts, and this is always being considered per hour. And later on, we're going to consider why we are considering here the amount of consumption per hour of appliance use. Now, in the case of electric power, for us to get the electric power that is being exerted upon a certain type of gadget, we're going to multiply voltage with the amount of current that is available. Okay, so once again, whenever we are talking about power, it is just the product of voltage, which is possessing the unit volts, and current, which is in ampere, okay, which will simply give us the watts or the wattage and the kilowatt that I mentioned earlier. Other than the presence of electric power, and when it comes to household electricity, it is not only electric power but also the electrical energy consumption. And for us to get the total amount of electrical energy consumption, we're going to multiply now the electric power to the time that it is being consumed. So technically, whenever we are going to consider the electrical energy consumption, it is equivalent to the unit kilowatt hour, which is more familiar to every single one of you. Because once again, whenever we are actually going to consider the amount of electricity that is being consumed in a certain type of household, we are computing it by hour. Okay? Every single time that it is being utilized on a certain type of appliance or a certain type of gadget. Other than those things mentioned, how are we going to apply this certain type of understanding when it comes to practical application? We're now going to adapt the concept of knowing how much are we going to pay for every single hour that we consume the certain amount of electricity, and which we are going to consider now the cost of electricity. As of May 2020, it is equivalent to 4 pesos and 38 centavos. Okay, so once again, as of May 2020, this is the amount of 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. Okay, so whenever you are consuming 1 kilowatt hour of electricity on any types of gadgets, you're actually going to spend 4 pesos and 38 centavos when it comes to the generation. Okay? It is not the generation cost. If we're going to observe your Meralco bill, Okay? There are actually different things that you can observe from this certain type of bill. On the front page, you're actually going to observe here the general breakdown, while at the back page, you are now going to observe the specific breakdown of why you arrive with a certain amount of electric bill. As of May 2020, this is the amount of electricity, and this may actually go up or go down depending upon the season, depending upon the generation of electricity itself. But remember, whenever we are actually paying electricity, we are not only relying on the generation cost only. The generation is almost equivalent only to half of our electricity expenses. Because some of the things that is mentioned on our electrical bill is not only about the amount of electricity that we consume on that specific period, but rather it also includes the generation loss. We are also considering here the transmission, we are also considering here system loss, even the transmission, and even distribution and other subsidies and taxes. So majority of the different things that is actually present in our Meralco bill, probably only 50 to 60% of our Meralco bill is actually from the generation only. But the remaining 40, 30, or even 20% of what we're actually paying on our Meralco bill is simply accumulated from other types of fees that we are actually going to pay in this certain type of company. If you're going to consider next time your Meralco bill, you're not only paying the generation or the electricity that you consume, but rather you're also paying other fees. Okay, so that's the thing actually whenever we are talking about the cost, or that is actually the thing whenever we are talking about the Meralco bill that is present in our homes. Now, how are we going to consider now the cost of the So now, how are we going to consider the total cost of electricity consumption of any appliance? So technically, for us to get the cost, we are just going to multiply here the electrical energy consumption. Then we're going to multiply this with the price. Okay? And once again, this price is fluctuating depending upon the usage and the generation that is available on that specific month. During the month of July, you can observe here that it is equivalent to 4 pesos and 38 centavos, but probably now, during October, the price is not the same. In this sample problem, how much power is used by an air conditioning unit per hour having current flow of 6.75 amperes and is attached to a 220 volt outlet? This problem will actually utilize 3 different types of steps, okay? Let's simply start with the first scenario. Once again, we are going to answer this using the Gressa method, starting off with the given. The given for this particular problem, for the first part, we have here the presence of current, which is equivalent to 6.75 amperes. Then, the voltage is equivalent to 220 volts. Then, our required, we are looking for the power. Then, E for equation, remember that power it is equivalent to volume times current. Then, for our solution, we are going to substitute the terms. Voltage, we have 220 volts. Then, we're going to multiply this with 6.75 amperes, in which it will give us the answer for the amount of power that is present in this air conditioning unit you consumed, 1,485 watts. Or, if you're now going to adopt household electricity, this is equivalent to 1.485 kilowatts. Okay, so once again, whenever we are considering household electricity, we are going to use kilowatt as our unit. Okay, so that's the thing about the first part. Once again, whenever we are going to consider electric power, we are now going to consider here the voltage as well as the current. Now, on the second part of the problem, how much electrical energy does it consume if it is used steadily for 8.5 hours? Let's now consider the electrical power that is answered on the previous problem. The total power it is equivalent to 1.485 kilowatts. And according to the problem, the time it is equivalent to 8.5 hours. Okay? Now, for the required, we are considering here the electrical energy consumption, or we can just use capital letter E and subscript letter E. Okay? Then subscript letter C. So this simply means electrical energy consumption. Okay? Then it is equivalent to power multiply it by time. Then for our solution, power it is 1.485 kilowatts. Then we're going to multiply it with 8.5 hours, in which it will give us the answer that is equivalent to 12.6225 kilowatt per hour. That is the amount of electrical energy that will simply be consumed by this air conditioning unit if it will be used directly or steadily for 8.5 hours. Now, let's consider the last part of the problem. It is mentioned here that how much did using this air conditioning unit cost the owner if it is used for 12 hours if the electricity is priced at 7.87 pesos per kilowatt hour. When it comes to this particular part of the problem, we are now going to focus with, once again, the power, then the time, and lastly, the last variable that we're going to consider here is the price. Okay? According to this problem, the power, it is still 1.485 kilowatts, then the time it is equivalent to 12 hours, then the price, it is now equivalent to 7.87 pesos per kilowatt hour. Now, for the required, we are looking for the cost. Then for the equation, it is now equivalent to cost. It's equivalent to electrical energy consumption times time. Then for the cost, since we do not actually have the direct answer for the electrical energy consumption, let's include here the power, which is 1.485 kilowatts times 12 hours. Then now let's consider the price, which is 7.87 pesos. When it comes to the cost, let's get first the total electrical energy consumption for 12 hours. So it is now equivalent to 1.485 times 12 hours. It will now give us 17.82 kilowatt hour. Then we're going to multiply it with the price, which is 7.87 pesos, which will simply give us the answer that is amounting to, do not forget the peso sign, 140.2434 pesos. That is the cost of your electrical consumption when it comes to this particular type of air conditioning unit. Okay, so remember, whenever we are going to consider now electric power, remember that we are going to consider here the amount of electricity that is consumed, then the time, and lastly, its cost. On page number 2 of your module, you're actually going to answer here the practice makes permanent, and the space that is provided on page number 9, you are going to write there your solution and your answers, or technically the whole GRESA. You're going to write the whole GRESA on page number 9, which is the sheet of paper in which you're going to accomplish for this particular module.